For decades, the ring looked familiar. Not identical, familiar. Royal watchers sensed something different but could never name it. The palace never announced a redesign. No press release, no ceremony, no acknowledgment at all. And yet, jewel experts eventually noticed a microscopic adjustment hidden inside the band. An adjustment so specific it could only have one purpose: to erase a history the monarchy never wanted examined. Before we continue, if you enjoy this, a like and subscribe really helps the channel grow. At first, the difference lived only in instinct. Observers who had followed royal appearances for years felt a quiet hesitation every time the ring surfaced in photographs. It carried the same presence, the same silhouette, yet something in the balance felt corrected. Not newer, not brighter, simply recalculated. No one could prove it. Not yet, but familiarity began to feel deliberate rather than natural. The palace archives offered nothing. Jewel commissions are normally documented with ceremonial pride, recorded for lineage and insurance alike. This one was silent. No restoration notice, no craftsmanship acknowledgement, no transfer record. An absence so complete it became louder than confirmation. The monarchy had not only avoided discussing the ring, it had avoided admitting it ever needed change. Then came the comparisons. Historians began studying photographs taken decades apart, isolating angles and proportions once dismissed as lighting differences. Close examinations revealed a subtle tightening of symmetry along the band's inner curve. The stone sat at the same height. The setting remained intact, but the support beneath it had shifted by fractions only a specialist would notice. Fractions, however, are where intention lives. At first, the explanation sounded harmless. Resizing happens constantly in royal jewelry. Fingers change, traditions adapt. Yet resizing expands or contracts evenly. This alteration did neither. One side of the band retained its original tension, while the opposite side carried a refined contour, almost as if the gold had been persuaded to remember an earlier shape while accommodating a new wearer. That was not adjustment. That was negotiation. More images surfaced. Public engagements separated by years showed reflections bending differently along the inner rim, a detail invisible to the crowd, but unmistakable to a trained eye. The ring had not been remade. It had been corrected around something already established, and corrections suggest prior ownership. Quiet whispers began to circulate among jewel specialists. Not accusations, not conclusions, only a shared unease. The curvature matched a style once favored by Diana's personal jewel fittings, where comfort required a slight anatomical tilt rather than a round uniform band. A private preference, a precise habit, one rarely copied because it only suited one hand. The monarchy said nothing, which only deepened the suspicion. Because in royal tradition, silence rarely means ignorance. It means containment. But noticing a change was only the beginning. Understanding why it was changed meant going backward to the moment the ring first entered the royal orbit. Long before the world saw an engagement interview, the ring already existed, and not where people believed. The official story says it was chosen from a selection, but records suggest the ring had been commissioned earlier than the proposal itself, earlier than Camilla, earlier than the public relationship entirely. The timeline doesn't just shift the romance, it rewrites who the ring was meant for. Royal engagements are choreographed carefully, but preparation always leaves a trace. Behind the public announcements lie schedules, fittings, and private consultations that must happen weeks, sometimes months, in advance. When researchers began aligning those preparations against the official narrative, the sequence stopped making sense. The jeweler associated with the ring logged a confidential appointment long before the relationship it celebrated had stabilized. Not close before. Significantly before. The visit was quiet, conducted without the ceremonial aids normally attached to such moments. No engagement planners, no press advisors, only a single senior representative and a request described as structural preparation. That wording alone unsettled historians. Structural preparation implies an owner already known, a hand already measured, a future already expected. It does not belong to a spontaneous selection from a tray of options. The palace later framed the ring as a meaningful choice made in affection, yet internal scheduling patterns contradicted that simplicity. Jewelry commissions tied to royal proposals usually follow confirmation of intent, not anticipation of it. Here, the order came first. The relationship narrative followed afterward. The symbolism had been prepared before the story that justified it. More inconsistencies surfaced in archived design notes. Early measurements documented a narrower finger base and a specific curvature requirement, subtle, precise, unmistakably tailored. When compared to the wearer the public associated with the ring, the proportions did not align. Not dramatically different, but enough to require modification. Enough to demand alteration instead of simple resizing. The ring had not been created for the hand that eventually received it. Staff testimonies added another layer of unease. Several attendants referenced holding a secured item in storage, months before any official engagement planning began. They were instructed not to label it as a gift or commission, only as an item reserved for future use. Reserved for whom, no one recorded. But reservation implies expectation, and expectation suggests intention that predates the public narrative entirely. The monarchy thrives on continuity, yet continuity can reveal truths it tries to soften. If the ring existed before the romance presented to the world, then it belonged to a plan already unfolding beneath appearances. A symbol waiting for a moment rather than created by one. And symbols created in advance rarely belong to coincidence. They belong to someone specific. That realization reframed the earlier discovery. The alteration inside the band was no longer simply technical. It became adaptive, almost careful, as though the jewel had been asked to change hands without losing identity. The gold had been persuaded to accommodate a different future while preserving a past it was originally shaped for. And that discrepancy matters, because the ring's structure wasn't romantic, it was personal. Inside the band lies a detail no camera ever shows. A microcurve, invisible unless magnified. Jewelers don't add curves without reason. They follow anatomy, and anatomy leaves signatures. When specialists measured the angle of that curvature, they didn't find a generic sizing adjustment. They found a match. Not to the current wearer, but to the finger proportions of someone whose jewelry measurements were meticulously archived decades earlier. Royal jewelry is catalogued with obsessive precision. Every piece, especially those tied to senior members, is documented not only for value, but for fit. Finger width, knuckle rise, even habitual movement, all preserved in private records so pieces can be maintained without repeated fittings. It is a practice built on continuity, and continuity quietly becomes a map of identity. A ring, once shaped to a hand, carries that hand's geometry long after the moment passes. The microcurve revealed exactly that kind of geometry. A standard resizing expands or contracts the circle evenly. This one did not. The lower arc held a slight anatomical tilt, compensating for a knuckle that required the stone to sit upright when worn. Without that tilt, the setting would lean outward. It was not decoration. It was accommodation, an adaptation for a specific hand that moved in a specific way. Specialists compared the angle against archived measurement profiles preserved from earlier royal fittings. The correspondence was unnerving. The curvature aligned with adjustments recorded for Diana's personal pieces, modifications once described as necessary because traditional rings would rotate slightly during wear. Jewelers at the time had solved it with a subtle counterbalance inside the band. A quiet correction meant to remain invisible. The present wearer's documented proportions told a different story. A straighter finger line, a broader base. No need for that inward bias. If the ring had been created originally for her, the curve would not exist. And if resized properly, it would have been removed. Instead, it survived. Not softened, not filed away, simply worked around. Evidence inside the metal confirmed the compromise. Reinforcement was added near the interior seam, strengthening the circle without disturbing the original tilt. That technique preserves shape rather than replaces it. It protects a structure already considered important. In other words, the ring was adjusted to fit a new hand while keeping the old hand's architecture intact. At that point, the conclusion became unavoidable. The ring had not been transformed. It had been negotiated with. The gold was persuaded outward, the diameter widened, yet the internal memory remained untouched. A physical echo of the person it first served. Not a coincidence, not a generic inheritance, but a deliberate preservation hidden beneath the surface. And once understood, the alteration changed meaning entirely. The ring was no longer simply passed on. It was carried forward with evidence embedded inside it, as though history had been folded rather than erased. A decision both careful and risky, because preserving structure preserves origin, which raised a far more uncomfortable question. If the ring wasn't originally hers, why redesign it instead of replacing it? Royal protocol favors replication. When symbolism becomes complicated, the palace commissions copies. It has done so countless times before. But in this case, they didn't. They altered the original. Not cheaper, not easier, not cleaner. The monarchy chose the single option guaranteed to leave a trace, meaning preserving the core mattered more than hiding the past. The crown has always understood that objects carry narratives, and when those narratives become inconvenient, duplication becomes diplomacy. Replicas allow tradition to continue while quietly separating present from memory. Several historic pieces have lived double lives this way. One version for history, another for harmony. The public never notices, and the institution moves forward unchallenged. Replacement is safety. Replacement is silence. Yet this ring never received that treatment. No twin was commissioned, no substitute introduced. Instead, craftsmen were instructed to work directly on the original metal, a decision far riskier than starting fresh. Altering a historic piece invites scrutiny. Microscopic irregularities appear. Records must be sealed. The more careful the modification, the louder its existence becomes to those trained to look. Choosing alteration over duplication meant accepting that traces would remain. Financially, replication would have been simpler. Royal workshops possess both skill and materials to reproduce any design flawlessly. Cost was not the obstacle, nor was time. What stood in the way was meaning. A replica removes continuity. It creates distance between past and present. This ring was not permitted that distance. Someone decided its identity had to survive even if its ownership changed. The jeweler involved reportedly worked under unusually strict confidentiality. Not merely discretion, restriction. No sketches retained, no apprentices present, no workshop documentation beyond structural necessity. Such measures are not used for routine adjustments. They belong to projects where the existence of the work itself could provoke questions the palace preferred unasked. Inside royal circles, disagreements quietly formed. Some advisors favored replacement, the clean solution, the one that would protect appearances indefinitely. Others resisted. They argued the symbolism of continuity outweighed the discomfort of discovery. To them, erasing the original would not remove history. It would deny it. The debate was never public, but its result lived in gold. The ring remained itself. Emotion sat beneath the decision. Altering the piece acknowledged its past while insisting it still had a role in the present. It became neither entirely old nor entirely new, a compromise forged between memory and necessity. That balance reflected more than policy. It reflected a personal attachment strong enough to overrule institutional instinct, because institutions seek stability, but individuals seek connection. And when the two collide, the object closest to the heart often reveals the truth. And that compromise only makes sense when you understand what the ring symbolized to Charles himself. Publicly, the ring belonged to the present. Privately, it anchored the past. Those close to Charles noted he never referred to it as new, only as restored. A curious word for a marriage symbol. Restoration preserves origin, and origin implies attachment. The redesign wasn't about removing Diana. It was about making the object survivable in a life that had moved forward, while its meaning had not. In private conversations, wording often reveals what protocol conceals. Courtiers recalled how carefully he spoke about certain objects, never casually, never possessively. The ring was discussed with the same tone used for heirlooms rather than gifts. Not something acquired, but something carried forward. Even in moments meant to celebrate the present, the language drifted backward, as if the piece existed across two timelines at once. Restoration is a deliberate choice of expression. Replacement ends a story. Restoration continues one. By insisting on that word, he acknowledged the ring had a history independent of its current role. It had not been created for a moment, but adapted to survive beyond one. The distinction mattered because it allowed memory to remain without direct admission, a quiet compromise between personal sentiment and public expectation. Separation rarely erases attachment when symbols remain close. The monarchy, more than most institutions, preserves emotion through objects. Letters are archived, rooms maintained, clothing catalogued, not for nostalgia, but for continuity. Jewelry becomes especially powerful because it lives on the body, moving between eras without explanation. The ring therefore functioned less as decoration and more as connection, a link that could exist without discussion. Staff began to notice subtle behavior around it. Handling was cautious, almost reverent. It was not stored casually among other daily pieces but kept apart, placed in a specific case, rather than the broader collection. Not hidden, but distinguished. That separation quietly acknowledged difference. Among many items representing duty, this one represented memory. Records reflected the same distinction. Maintenance notes tracked the ring individually instead of grouping it with shared holdings. Documentation remained minimal yet precise, suggesting awareness that too much detail might provoke questions while too little risked loss. It occupied a rare category, preserved but not explained. In that tension lived its emotional weight. The ring allowed past and present to coexist without confrontation. It satisfied obligation while protecting sentiment, embodying a history that could not be publicly retold, yet could not be abandoned either. Its survival depended on balance, altered enough to be worn, unchanged enough to remain meaningful. But emotional attachment alone doesn't explain the final detail, the one almost nobody noticed. During the redesign, one mark could have been removed effortlessly. a tiny internal ridge beneath the stone setting, invisible in normal wear, completely unnecessary structurally. Yet it remained. Jewelers don't leave redundant metal, unless removing it would erase proof of origin. That ridge matches a stabilization technique used in only one previous royal commission, a commission tied directly to Diana. The discovery changed the tone of the investigation. Until that moment, everything suggested adaptation, compromise, adjustment around an existing form. But the ridge was different. It was not a consequence of resizing or reinforcement. It was a signature, a deliberate method used by a specific craftsman solving a specific problem for a specific client. A detail so particular it rarely appeared twice because it was never part of standard practice. This technique stabilized a stone that naturally leaned due to the wearer's hand position. Instead of thickening the band or lowering the setting, the jeweler added a hidden counterweight ridge beneath the mount. Subtle, efficient, invisible unless the ring was dismantled or magnified under professional inspection. The method was recorded once before in royal archives, decades earlier, when a young royal required her engagement piece altered for comfort and balance. The same structural logic, the same placement, the same restraint. Removing the ridge during redesign would have been simple if erasure were the goal. A complete reset of the interior would eliminate any trace of prior tailoring. Yet eliminating it required lifting the stone from its mount, rebuilding the seat, and recasting the alignment, effectively remaking the ring. Instead, the modification worked around the ridge, preserving it even while altering diameter and contour. Preservation demands intention, and intention implies acceptance of what the ridge represented. When jewel historians compared workshop methodologies, the connection sharpened. The ridge reflected the habits of a particular royal workshop known for customizing pieces rather than replacing them. Their philosophy favored adapting jewelry to the wearer's movement rather than forcing the wearer to adapt to the jewel. Records showed only one commission from that workshop, matching the exact placement and scale. That commission occurred long before the ring's public narrative began. The implication reached beyond coincidence. The ridge predated the current wearer entirely. It belonged to a moment when the ring answered a different life, a different routine, a different expectation. It survived resizing, survived polishing, survived quiet reinterpretation, because removing it would not merely change structure, it would change identity. Experts who studied the alteration reached an uncomfortable consensus. The redesign had not attempted to disguise origin. It had preserved it under controlled conditions, allowing the piece to function while keeping its history intact beneath the surface. Not an oversight, not a technical limitation, a choice. And once recognized, the ring ceased to behave like ornamentation. It began to act like evidence, carrying within its metal the memory of the hand it first served. By then, the ring was no longer just jewelry, it was testimony. When questions finally reached official channels, the response was precise. No comment. Not denial. Not clarification. Silence. The monarchy's most practiced language. Because confirming the redesign confirms continuity. And continuity confirms the object never truly changed owners, only narratives. Inquiries arrived carefully at first. Historians framed them as technical curiosity, journalists as routine verification. Each received the same reply, delivered politely and without elaboration. The wording never varied. It neither defended nor corrected. It simply refused participation. And in royal communication, refusal is rarely absence. It is positioning. Requests for archival consultation were redirected to general records, where the ring appeared only as part of broader collections, never individually detailed. Photographic comparisons were acknowledged, but not addressed. Even maintenance logs, usually released in summarized form for historic pieces, remained restricted. The message was unmistakable. The institution recognized the attention, yet declined the conversation. Privately, some researchers were advised to pursue other topics. Not warned, not threatened, encouraged. The distinction mattered. Direct suppression would create conflict. Gentle redirection preserved harmony while achieving the same result. The subject became socially inconvenient rather than officially forbidden. A subtle containment strategy perfected over generations. Acknowledging the redesign would create a symbolic complication. Royal objects function as anchors of continuity. They represent inheritance without interruption. To admit that a piece retained a prior personal identity while serving a new one would blur that clarity. The monarchy depends on symbols appearing stable even when lives behind them shift. Therefore, ambiguity became safer than explanation. Public perception followed predictable patterns. Without confirmation, speculation fragmented. Some dismissed the theory, others debated endlessly, but no unified conclusion formed. The palace did not need belief, it needed uncertainty. Uncertainty dissolves controversy by dividing it into opinions instead of facts. The ring remained visible yet undefined, allowing it to exist without a fixed narrative attached. Within royal tradition, inherited symbols obey an unwritten rule. They must feel timeless, not transitional. A jewel can pass between generations, but it cannot visibly carry emotional residue from one relationship into another. Doing so would humanize the monarchy too openly, exposing personal continuity where institutional permanence is expected. Silence, therefore, protected more than privacy. It preserved mythology. And mythology thrives on what is shown, not explained. The ring continued appearing at ceremonies, at formal occasions, at moments of unity, always present, never interpreted. The absence of commentary became its own statement, reinforcing the boundary between private memory and public role. And that silence may explain why the ring was never allowed to be publicly discussed, only worn. Today, millions see the ring as a symbol of continuity, yet hidden within it is a quieter truth, a preserved beginning, a private correction, and a memory reshaped rather than erased. It is not just a royal heirloom. It is evidence of hesitation, affection, regret, and perhaps reconciliation. All sealed into gold, no one was ever meant to examine this closely. For generations, royal jewels were presented as permanent decisions. A crown meant destiny, a brooch meant duty, a ring meant certainty. But this ring refuses certainty. It carries two moments at once: the public declaration that defined a marriage, and the private beginning that existed before the world was invited in. One layer belongs to history, the other belongs to feeling. The metal does not choose between them, it holds both. That changes everything. Because the monarchy survives on clarity, its symbols are supposed to tell a single story: deliberate choices, unwavering roles, unbroken continuity. Yet inside this band lives hesitation. The first setting was intimate, almost tentative, shaped not for cameras, but for closeness. The later redesign was stronger, more formal, made to withstand the weight of expectation. Instead of replacing the first with the second, someone folded them together. The institution remained visible. The emotion was buried beneath it, but never removed. Objects rarely speak, yet this one does. Not loudly, not proudly, but persistently. The seam hidden within the gold turns the ring into an archive. It preserves a moment that official accounts streamlined away. The uncertainty before the announcement, the human pause before ceremony hardened into narrative. The redesign becomes a confession that cannot be quoted. No statement was released. no admission recorded. But the metal remembers what language avoided. And with that realization, relationships inside the story shift. What looked like a simple inheritance becomes layered communication across time. The wearer carries not just legacy, but unresolved memory. The gesture becomes more than tribute. It becomes transmission. The past was not replaced. It was carried forward carefully, deliberately, almost protectively. Love, in this telling, is not erased by history. It is edited, then quietly restored where only patience would notice. So the ring stops being proof of a perfect beginning. Instead, it becomes proof of reconsideration. A decision revisited without announcement. A past acknowledged without apology. Whether the act was meant as preservation or remorse cannot be proven. And perhaps that uncertainty is the point. The monarchy offered a clean narrative. The ring offers a human one, complicated, conflicted, unfinished. And once you see the detail, the story the monarchy told can never quite look the same again.